that the 23rd of March 1921, of which we'll have a centenary very shortly, was probably the most important day in the life of Rama. That's the day when she met Mahatma Gandhi. It was a transformative moment for her. Indeed, it was a transformative moment for everyone who met Gandhiji in those 2 or 3 years when he launched his non-cooperation movement in 1920, promising Swaraj within 1 year, in the memory of Lokmanya Tilak, who had just passed away. Between 1920 and 1921, I think Mahatma Gandhi traveled further and wider than he ever had in his life, either before or afterwards, carrying the message of non-cooperation. And his promise was based on the fact that if the country indeed took to non-cooperating with the British Raj would collapse in no time at all. I'm reminded of another person who had met Gandhiji, not met Gandhiji. He was far away in a crowd, in a large crowd, in a very distant place from Cuttack. This was in Gorakhpur in East UP. And this person who listened to a speech by Gandhiji on the 8th of February 1921, which is coming up even sooner, was the Hindi novelist Premchand. Premchand had been in government service for 21 years as a headmaster, well, as a a schoolmaster, then headmaster, also a sub-deputy inspector of schools. He was doing well. He was also writing at the same time. And he went and listened to Gandhi, and he came home, and he told his wife, Shivarani Devi, she said, after listening to Gandhiji, I feel I must also resign. And she said, yes, of course, if you want to resign, you go ahead. But let's think about what we'll do next. And they thought about it. They thought about it very hard for a week. And then on the 15th of February, if you think long and hard about something, chances are you will not do it. But after having thought about it for a whole week, Premchand went and resigned. The appeal of Gandhiji's movement of non-cooperation was absolutely magical, and it transformed not only individuals but also, I'm sorry, there's a bit of hammering going on. I'm not doing it, but I live in a society, a cooperative society with flats, and somebody perhaps getting some furniture made. Do bear with it. It's part of the necessary toils of our daily life. It doesn't disturb you too much. Oh, Vikram Babu. I see Vikram Babu as well here. Wonderful. Yes. So I was talking about how lives are transformed overnight, in a day, within a few days. That's one quality of life. And biographies. How do I know Premchand? Because, as has already been mentioned, because I had great privilege of translating his movement. It is indeed a very important thing to have biographies written and then to double check them, going back which and sometimes what we have biographies and autobiographies have begun to exercise a greater fascination for readers than probably they ever have before. Life writing has really come into it, and that promises well for everybody, I think, connected with not only literature, not only literary studies, but indeed with the whole wide range of life itself. One thing I'd suggest then to this translation center, and I understand from Madhusmita that you have already compiled a wonderful long bibliography of life writings in in Odia, and you have also begun to translate some of them. What I would suggest to you is that another way of going about it would be to choose transformative historical moments, perhaps, like the year 2021, in which we are celebrating or perhaps not celebrating the centenary, and to see how that crucial historical moment affected not one life but many lives all over India, and perhaps to put these together in a multilingual anthology, which will, of course, maybe translated into the major languages. There are so many possibilities in the scheme that you have taken up, and I'm full of excitement, and I can imagine that many of you must be totally driven with excitement at what you have already been doing and what you are going on to do. I also noticed that the Hindi, English, and Urdu departments have come together in this conversation for leading on language, not only self-employed and regional languages individually. More languages come together. It's not one plus one plus one that becomes three when three languages and literature departments come together. It has a much greater collective force than just three. A synergy is generated, which is exciting and even unpredictable in what it might lead on to. So I'm delighted that you have this tremendous basis for building a huge body and a very impressive and productive body of work on. My lecture, which has already proceeded for a few minutes, is meant to be divided into three parts. My subtitle, Five Questions, Six Answers, is not accurate. Do not keep counting. There'll be many more than five questions, and each question will have many possible answers. It's not a multiple answer criteria in which only one answer is meant. Literally, all answers will be a realistic answer. The first part I will do is about India in general for a while. The second part I'll talk about some life writing in English and Hindi, which I wish I also knew earlier. I know words in translation, but not very many, not competent to talk about it. And then in the last part, the third part, I will narrate to you my own experience translating a biography, the one which has already been mentioned. And it is then that I will specifically ask some questions about what is involved in translating biographies and how one may go about not one way of going about it, but other ways of going about it. Why I hinted at the multiplicity of answers of each question in my narrative. Life writing, what is the difference between life writing and the old word biography? None. Biography also means life writing. Bio is life, graphy means writing. Epigraph, photograph, photograph is writing life. So literally, etymologically, both are the same words. Except that old words sometimes become not very connotative, and we need a new phrase, a new substitute. We need a new bottle if we don't need new wine. But as I said, there's a new popularity of the genre and new respectability that it has attracted. Uh, and this is because of several reasons, it seems to me. It's not only biography, it's not only autobiography, also memoirs are becoming more and more prolific and thick on the ground. Memoirs can be of two kinds, of course. One is an important person remembering the people he has met in his life and the crucial incidents of his life. And the other is, if you like, from the other end of the telescope, which would be a person who's not important in himself or herself, recollecting some very important people that he or she has met. So it works both ways in memoirs. But the question that I wish to ask, which some people may find theoretical, but I don't, is the general question uh, is life writing a genre which is theme based or form based? If it is theme based, can it manifest itself in many different forms? I think this is correct. It's biography or life writing is not a form by itself. It is a kind of thematological writing in which One is writing biographies or autobiographies or memoirs, and these can come in any literary form actually. People have said, I mean, what's the difference between autobiography and biography? And what is the difference between fiction on the one hand and autobiography and biography on the other hand? Increasingly, we are recognizing the fact that fiction is fictional, of course, but even autobiographies and biographies are a form of fiction. We now say that even history is a form of fiction or narrative. We need not be too postmodernist about it, but that there is an element of reordering, there is an element of selection, there is an element of artistic representation in each one of these genres so that the truth claim of a biography or an autobiography may not be much greater than that of a work of fiction. When fiction and history are now understood to be similarly narratives, there cannot be a hard and fast division between autobiographies and biographies on the one hand and works which are explicitly works of fiction on the other hand. I think we need to recognize this. Another thing that we need to think about is what is the auto element in autobiography? Where does it leave the writer? Uh, and one thing to think about here is Gandhiji was worried about it. When Gandhiji began writing his autobiography in the mid 1920s, and it came out, he wrote it in Gujarati in weekly installments in his own paper, and then it was translated by Mahadev Desai and came out in English as well. And then the revised, not biography, but a revised translation came out in 1940, which is the one that we read now, the story of my experiments with truth. Now, what Gandhiji did right at the beginning was he worried about the fact that he was writing an autobiography. It's not an Indian thing to do. And he said he discussed this with several friends. And one friend of his, a Nirmal Hridaya Mitra, Nirmal Hridaya, that's a lovely, lovely adjective to describe a friend. He said to Gandhi, but what you are doing is not writing an autobiography in conscious about any vanity being involved. Atmakatha need not be, he does not say it, but I'm extending this point now from what Gandhi has in his preface to the autobiography. Atmakatha need not be Atmashlavha. It need not be self-praise or not that alone. It can also be Atma Pariksha. It can also be Atmanveshana. It can be an investigation into oneself. To write out one's life is to find out what one has done with one's life. It is introspection. So many possibilities open. And Gandhiji was showing one of them, while also feeling self-conscious that it is autobiography is a Western genre, and it is against the very genius of Indian sensibility to go towards it, to begin practicing it. This Atma business has been exploited by other writers as well. Hazari Prasad Trivedi, who was a very he spent many years at Shantiniketan with Gurudev, of course, and also with a person with whom he had a greater interaction, more creative interaction, Acharya Kriti Mohan Sen, who was a great scholar, unlike him. So, Hazari Prasad Trivedi wrote a book called Bana Bhatt Ki Atma Katha. Now, Bana Bhatt lived and died in the 7th century. So how can he write an autobiography now and that not in Sanskrit but in Hindi, a language that did not exist then? And Hadari Prasad Ji's humorous, amusing explanation was that it is his Atma ki katha. Atma is Atma. That's the self and the soul, and also, of course, a part of the Paramatma. So the connotations of Atma in Hindi and Sanskrit and Urdu, I'm sure, and many other languages are totally mind blowing. And when we are talking about life writing, I think we should keep that huge connotation at the back of our minds. There's another example that I'd like to mention in passing. One of the best Hindi novels ever written. It's in two parts, published in 1942 and 1944 with the same title. And it ranks, in most people's opinion, next only to Godan. When we are ranking great Hindi novels, I think it's next only to Godan in most people's opinion. It's called Shekhar Ek Jeevani. It's by Agay. Chidanand Bhattacharya, Agay, and it's called Shekhar Ek Jeevani. Why is it called Jeevani when it is clearly a novel? This again, one of the complexities of what we call life writing now. All these coexist under the same umbrella. What I was saying earlier about how the element of fiction or the element of self fashioning and self representation may be present in fiction as well as in
Sneha ma'am.
uh, so called factual
Harish
or
Sneha ma'am.
truthful accounts of
Hindi.
oneself as in a biography
Hindi.
or autobiography.
Sneha.
This book, Shekhar Ek Jeevani, that is
Why?
called autobiography, a Jeevani, is in fact clearly fiction. It is autobiographical fiction. And again, could have gone either way, depending on how he wrote it up. And he poses a challenge to all readers. Even now, there are not too many other works of fiction I know which are called Jeevani. There is a very distinct one available to us in English, which comes close to
जो
Jeevan and
thank
Jeevani.
you दादा.
And that is even better in English, actually. There are very few things that are better in English than in Hindi, but this is one of them. It is a life. If you say Premchand, a life, what does that mean? It means a biography. It does not mean his life, it means a narrative of his life, which is a biography. And it can mean both those things at the same time. So let us keep in mind these many dimensions. Another thing I'd like to bring in here is what is a life and how do we reckon it? How do we perceive it? There was a very popular series, not only one but many, and it had the title for all volumes, The Life and Works of
First recording किए करथिला?
The Life
ସତ୍ୟ
and Works
କରିଥିଲା?
of major figures, historical figures.
ହୁଁ. ଥିବ.
The Lives and Poets by Samuel Johnson. It's not own life.
ସେପଟୁ ଯଦି ସିଏ ରେକର୍ଡ଼ିଂ କରିଥିବେ
Life also involves
ଆଡ଼୍
spoiler
କରିଦେବା.
very often,
ଆଡ଼୍
and
କରିଦେବା.
therefore explicitly sometimes
ଭିଡ଼ିଓ
is
ମର୍ଜ
called
କରନ୍ତି ଯେମିତି
Life and Works. In Urdu, the
ସେଇଠି
phrase is
ଆପ୍ସ ଗୁଡ଼ା
Hayat
ଡାଉନଲୋଡ଼
or
କରି
Karname.
କରିଦେବା.
Karname is not ironical as it is in Hindi. Karname is a very serious word in Urdu in this context. Yadgar, some of the first biographies written in Urdu were by Altaf Hussain Hali, who was a transformative, transitional figure in Urdu literature. And he wrote one called Yadgar-e Memoirs, Memories of a Ghalib, the poet. Then he wrote another one. It's called Hayat-e-Javed. And the first is Yadgar, the second is Hayat. Hayat means life. This Hayat-e-Javed is the life of somebody whom he actually knew, while he did not know Ghalib. That's the distinction that he's trying to make. He writes as if he knew Ghalib. It's not entirely factual. It's nicely fictional, that one. Enhanced, if you like. Facts are enhanced. But from life and works, let's come to something else. That's the division I'm more interested in. Works that one achieves are public achievements and are there for everyone to see. But is that the only part of one's life that exists? There is a life that is enacted in public achievements, and there is another life that is lived within oneself. They're not completely distinct one from the other. No. I hope there's an overlap, because otherwise it'll be sheer hypocrisy. But it's not a one-to-one correlation. This question was raised very importantly and somewhat rhetorically with tremendous persuasive quality by the novelist Virginia Woolf in that wonderful essay called Modern Fiction. She said, what is life? Is it going from breakfast to lunch to dinner? Is it living in a house, which can be described very accurately? Is it wearing a kind of a coat? And this is from another essay, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, which can be described by a novelist very accurately as color, the buttons, how many buttons, what color buttons, what it might have cost, and so on. Is that life? If we describe all this, are we describing a life? She said no. But look within, she said, and life is not like that. We have an inner life. There are I mean, there are many kinds of persons. But to make a very broad and crude distinction, there are people whose claim to eminence lies in the fact that they are men of action, and therefore men of works and achievement. And then there is another kind of person whose distinction lies in the fact that he or she is a contemplative person, is a creative person, and the two bring very different achievements to the world, very different contributions to what we understand by life. After Freud, particularly, the importance of the inner life has been recognized in a way that it wasn't before or not so expected before in academic terms. Now, Virginia Woolf herself wrote 3 biographies, which goes to show that she played around with this idea in as many inventive ways as perhaps any one writer has. She wrote a biography called Flush. Flush is the name of a dog. This is the dog of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And this dog, a little spaniel, witnesses the great love relationship between Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. And also, of course, their poetic compositions. Witness to all that. But from a point of view that you would not suspect to exist, having access to everything, free access, as a roaming dog in the house. Another biography that she wrote is even more inventive in some ways. It's called Orlando, and the protagonist of it
51.
lives for 400 years.
51.
Begins in the times of
51
Elizabeth
join
I,
କରିଥିଲି
in the 18th century, goes to sleep, and from having been a courtier and a warrior at the court of Elizabeth I, now becomes a woman. The androgyny of the human subject is highlighted in what is a very elegantly comic manner. And then she wrote another biography towards the end of her life in 1940. She died in 41. It's called Roger Fry. Roger Fry was a painter and an art critic in the Bloomsbury Group who was very well known to Virginia Woolf personally. Had been an ordinary, normal biography. Virginia Woolf tried all these three. And in discussing biography in an essay, she came up with an image, as creative writers do, which I think may be worth keeping with us when we read biographies, when we assess biographies, or any kind of life writing. She said that a biographer should seek to combine and blend 2 elements: granite, I'm sorry, but I say granite while most people say granite. It's the same thing, that hard stone. Granite and rainbow. A biographer should capture both. A biographer should seek to combine
600 MB
hard facts and
MB
still, based on them,
visual and
plentiful imagination, catching all
ଏଇଠି
the
ଦେଖେଇବା
colors of one's life and not only the hard facts.
ହଁ
A shilling life will give you all the facts, W.H. Auden said. All the facts, so called, of a life are very quickly and easily narrated, and they may miss that person altogether. How father beat him, how he ran away, what were the sorrows of his youth, as Auden goes on to say. But is that life? This is a question that we must keep in mind, and when we translate biographies, when we read biographies, we must have not only a conception at the back of our minds which the biographer has or the autobiographer has, but what other people may have meant by life and by the depiction and representation of life in a variety of ways. Let me move now quickly to outline some biographies, some autobiographies, as I said, in Hindi. Enough of Virginia Woolf. Now let's move on to Hindi. I've done my bit by the English department. Now let me go to the Hindi department. Uh, in Hindi, there are not many biographies. I was very surprised, very pleasantly surprised, when Madhusmita told me that there's a long list of biographies in Udia that has been compiled. I'd love to see it. I'd love to see when it begins. I'd love to see how it carries on. I'd love to know how many of these are called great significant biographies and how widely, well, when they were written and how widely they've been translated. I can only present to you some little information from Hindi as my own little contribution to what you're doing. Uh, it's said that the first autobiography in Hindi was written around the year 1640. I have read it. It's in Brajabhasha. It's a free. It's a very ordinary person writing it. He's a trader. He's a minor poet. He recites poetry. In fact, he recites poetry for a living to entertain people, other people's poetry. Sufi Premakyan from around the time of Jayasri and Tulsidas. He writes it in verse. It's an autobiography in verse. It's called Ardh Kathanak. It was completed when he was 55 years old. And he was a Jain, Banarsi Das, his name is. The Jain belief is, or was then, that one lives to be 110 years. That's the span of life. And he narrated the first years of the first half of his life, he thought, uh, up to 55, up to the age of 55, except that he died before he was 60. It was pretty much his whole life. It's very interesting. He's very mundane, and that's his interest. When lives were being written only of monarchs and great warriors, and Rajas and Maharajas, and Sultans and Badshahs, here is the life of a very ordinary man from about 1640. But after that, there's nothing. In Hindi, there's one or two genres which ought to be very ill represented in Hindi, very poorly productive. One is drama, for one thing, and the other is biography. In fact, a big foundation, a nicely funded foundation, is now funding people to write biographies of modern writers. The Raza Foundation, run by Ashok Bajpayee, is actually commissioning people to write biographies of modern, contemporary, or near contemporary poets and writers to fill that perceived gap. So after Ardh Kathanak, what do we have in Hindi? We have another autobiography which is very fetching indeed, very attractive, in 4 volumes, is by the poet Harivansh Rai Bachchan, who is unfortunately now better known for being the father of someone, but he was a great figure in his own right. The first volume of his biography is called Kya Bhulu, Kya Yaad Karu. The title comes from a poem that he had written many years ago. क्या भूलूं क्या याद करूं मैं सुधियों के बंधन से कैसे सुधियों के बंधन से कैसे अपने को आजाद करूं मैं. What sudhi? I hope the word exists in Udia too. Sudhi has two meanings. And I was very struck. I've known this word for a long time, but I was very struck looking at it in this context. Sudhi, in one sense, means consciousness, awareness. वो सुध बुध खो बैठे. He lost his wits. He wasn't aware of where he was, what he was doing. Sudh budh ko बैठे. Budh is buddhi. Sudhi and buddhi. It goes together. The other meaning, as used here, खुदियों के बंधन से कैसे अपने को आजाद करूं मैं क्या ढूंढूं क्या याद करूं सुधी मीन्स मेमोरी तबहू का अंब अवसर पाई मेरी ओ सुधी ध्याई भी कछु करुण कथा चलाई Tulsidas writes, it's a petition to Sita, not to Ram. Says, Mother, finding an auspicious moment, why don't you remind Ramchandra, God Ramchandra, that Tulsidas exists looking for his kripa, his grace. Sudhidyai, remember me to Ram. Now, this is a wonderful conflation of memory and awareness, which exists in the same word. What you have forgotten is not part of your consciousness. It may come up through the subconscious, but it's not Sudhi. It has to be brought up in the conscious to become memory again. The interplay of consciousness and memory, because there's memory even beyond consciousness, but you're not conscious of it until you become conscious of it. It's a wonderful paradox. The Urdu poet Firak has many things to say about it. मुद्दतों गुजरी तेरी याद भी आई न हमें और हम भूल गए हो तुम्हें ऐसा भी नहीं for a long period I never remembered you but it's not as if I'd forgotten you दिल को कई कहानियां याद सी आके रह गई याद सी आके रह गई I almost remembered them memory almost brought them back to me this is the poetic border which defines consciousness and memory and the interplay between the two. I think Firak is wonderful on this, much more so than any 20th century poet in either Urdu or Hindi. And I think part of the reason is one should not ascribe these crude causes to the poetic process. But I think part of the reason is that he was aware of birdsong. As a professor of English at my university, the University of Allahabad, I think he had read birdsong. And he was aware of the philosophical thinking about memory, even apart from Freud. So there is Kya Bhulu Kya Yaad Karu, these two autobiographies, Ars Kathanak, Kya Bhulu Kya Yaad Karu. And then there are three great literary biographies. One is Premchand, Kalam Ka Sipahi. I'll come to that in a moment by Amrit Rai, the youngest son of Premchand. Another is Nirala Ki Sahitya Sadhana. Nirala the poet. Nirala Ki. Look, Kalam Ka Sipahi is one kind of approach to writing a life. And Nirala Ki Sahitya Sadhana, it seems more aestheticist. Another is by Rambilal Sharma. And at the same time, Amrit Rai and Rambilal Sharma had one thing in common. They had many things in common, but this above all, that they were both Pakka Marxists. And yet, one writes a book called Kalam Ka Sipahi and another writes a book called Sahitya Sadhana. And this is a book in three volumes. The first is biography, the second is a critical analysis of the works of Nirala, and the third has a long kind of retrospective introduction to Nirala's life in the third volume, and a selection of his legends. The third biography, great literary biography in Hindi, is called Avara Masiha. Avara Masiha. Avara Masiha is the life of Sharad Chand, the novelist, the Bengali novelist, written by uh, Vishnu Prabhakar, a Gandhian. And he said that when he had written the life, after 14 years of work and research, he was very anxious. कहीं मेरे बंगाली मित्र क्रुद्ध न हो जाएं. Everybody fears an angry Bengali. The ODIs do, the Hindi walas do, everyone does. But in this case, especially because the author was Bengali. And yet, there was no proper biography of Sharad Chandra in Bengali, so there was a gap that was filled by Vishnu Prabhakar in Hindi. So these are the three great biographies, I would say. Only the Premchand one has been translated. But there's something else about translation that I'd like to say, which is that a friend of mine was taught Hindi in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and later in Austin, Texas, a man called Rupert Snell. He is currently completing a translation of life writings, as we call them, autobiographies, biographies, memoirs of 51 books in selected extracts. He has made an anthology of life writing. I've seen the contents page and it's fascinating. He has arranged them by the year of the birth of the writer. And there are a couple of biographies in the beginning, couple of extracts from books in the beginning, which were not written originally in Hindi, but all the others are. There are 51 such extracts. It's a kind of Shobha Yatra of life writing in India. It's a grand procession, it's a grand parade. And if you're attracted to this idea, you might try something like that yourself. The book hasn't come out yet, but it is pretty much complete, pretty nearly complete. It should be coming out within the next year or so. So, so far as translation of life writing, and he has also translated an abridged version of Bachchan's autobiography. Bachchan's autobiography is not just Kya Bhulu Gaya Yaad Karune. It's in 4 volumes, of which that one is the first. So a 4 volume autobiography he has compressed into 1 volume in English. And sometimes you may have to take that kind of a decision. It seems cruel, it seems hard-hearted, but it seems possible. It is possible, it can be done. Rupert has done it. And if you wanted to translate all the 4 volumes as they stand in Hindi, it may never get done. Many pragmatic decisions have to be taken. I think I'm already over time or about, but I'll take 5, 7 more minutes to come to the last part, which is about the biography that I myself translated. The questions that I wish to ask about translating life writing or translating biography, they're very simple questions, and yet they're very vital questions. One is, whose biography or autobiography should one translate? It's a very important decision. Another question is, who will choose what to translate? Will the translator choose what to translate? Or will he be commissioned to translate by somebody else? Will he be directed to translate by somebody else? These may seem like almost trivial questions, but these are vital determinants of how good the translation is going to turn out to be and whether the translation is going to be possible at all. So these are not questions not to be thought about. Another, of course, central question is how to go about translating it. One question that we must address is translating a biography or an autobiography substantially different from how one translates a novel? Is it different from how one translates a poem? If so, what is the difference? Let me begin with the debating position, if you like, that there is no difference. Some people say that translating poetry is much harder than translating prose. Well, I mean, I don't know what kind of prose they've been translating. It's true that some kind of prose may be easier to translate, it may present fewer problems, but I think basically the use of language in any genre by a good writer, by a great writer, presents challenges equally across the board. So, is there a difference in translating the way you translate life writing from the way you translate other forms of writing, other genres of writing? That's the question that I think needs to be debated and with examples of actual translations. Another question to ask is, who will publish the translation? Life writing, as I said, is getting more and more significant, more and more visible and prominent. And at the same time, it doesn't have a very big market in translation. I don't think so, not yet. So these are all practical questions to keep before one. And the last question that I really bring up is, what is one life? How do we view it? Especially when We are not located in the language in which it was written. Because in the original language, the writer of an autobiography or a biography and the reader share an enormous amount of unspoken context. And that does not transfer through translation automatically into another language. As I said, it's not a problem only with knife writing, it's a problem equally with fiction. Let me now very briefly give you the answers that emerged to these questions in my own case in the translation of Premchand's biography by his son Amrit Rai, Premchand Kalam Ka Sipahi. Who got the idea that it should be translated and when? I hope you'll be amused, but this is how things work in life. This is life. The idea came up in the year 1980. Why? Why had it not come up before? Because 1980 was the birth centenary year of Premchand. So everybody was excited and everybody wanted to do something or the other, and therefore the time came for this biography to be translated. Who thought of the idea? Did Amrit Rai think of the idea? He had published the Hindi version 18 years before in 1962, and nothing had been done to translate it into English, even though it had won the Sahitya Academy Prize almost immediately. There is a scandal attached to that, but I will not go into it. There isn't time about the award. So, who got the idea? A publisher got the idea. It was not Amrit Rai's idea. It certainly was not my idea. A publisher got the idea. Who was the publisher? The publisher is now almost defunct, I believe, but then was a major source of wonderment in the land and very important. The publisher was People's Publishing House. People's Publishing House was known to be not only a leftist publishing house, but a communist publishing house almost, with funding received and other facilities received and other arrangements in common with the People's Publishing House in Moscow. So the Russian connection, the Soviet connection was self-evident. There was no need felt by anyone to hide it. Those books were very cheap. Translations of Chekhov and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. When I was a student in Allahabad University, whenever I won a prize, say 30 rupees book coupon or 50 rupees book coupon, I'd immediately go to the People's Publishing House shop near the university. And for 30 rupees, you could get almost 10 or 15 books. That's how cheap they were. At least 10 books, hardback. Nothing else was half as cheap. And the paper on which those books were printed was semi-art paper, very good quality. So all this people's published because it came from the USSR. So all this PPH had got going for them. They were a communist publishing house, and they said, claiming Premchand for communism or socialism at least, after his presidential address to the Progressive Writers Association first convention in Lucknow in 1936, that they will publish Premchand's biography in English. Amrit Rai was also a card-carrying communist when he was young. In fact, they also suggested to Amrit Rai a translator from Hindi into English, uh, who had published many translations before with the People's Publishing House into English, and who was also a party man. But Amrit Rai rejected that. Amrit Rai said, yes, you can have the book translated, but I will suggest my own translator. And that translator happened to be me. It was the finger of fate pointing at me. This year is also the birth centenary of Amrit Rai. I hope to write a memoir and an article on Amrit Rai in which I will narrate the circumstances, how it came about that I was chosen to translate it.
क्वेश्चन
But
कल
I'm over my time, so let me let that go. When the translation was complete and people, or when it was nearing completion, other publishers also got to hear about it. And they all wanted to post the translation. I had many approaches. I was living in Delhi, Amritsar, and Allahabad, so I was the point man. The Oxford University Press was interested. And then there were no other publishers, international, hardly. There was Macmillan, but that's all. All the others weren't there. That was very tempting, and to Amrit Rai particularly. And there was another publisher, Orient Longman, then it was called. And one of the editors said to me, why don't you give your book to a secular publisher? I love the use of that word. Secular meaning non-communist. He said, communists will not be able to circulate it very much. Give it to us. So there was a scramble for it. And how to translate, that's the story. I'm sorry I've left it very late, but it says that the English version is considerably shorter than the Hindi version. This may seem like blasphemy, but the one fact I can reveal right now is that the cuts were made, 75% of the cuts, maybe 80% of the cuts, were made by Amrit Rai himself. 18 years had passed since the book was first published in Hindi. It was reviewed, it was discussed, it had won a prize, all kinds of things had happened. But the view of Amrit Rai himself had changed about how that biography could have been written better. And he could not add passages, but he could at least take out passages to give it a different kind of shape. And that's what he did. Then, in connecting what was left behind, I reshuffled chapters. I revived some passages that he had cut, and I suggested to Amrit Rai some others that could be cut instead. It was a collaborative procedure. When Kanwar Singh, who came amongst us, great critic in Hindi, saw the English version, he said to me, Harish ji, आपने अमृत राय का उपकार किया है. You have done a favor to Amrit Rai by cutting it in this way. He thought I had cut it. Everybody thinks I have cut it. They don't know that it was Amrit Rai and me together, he more than me, who had done it. Well, anyhow, the book came out. It was very widely reviewed. It was a huge success. It was reprinted. Then Amrit Rai did finally have his wish. And 9 years later, it was published in 1982. In 1991, it was Amrit Rai gave it to Oxford University Press for reprint. And they are the ones who've been reprinting it ever since. I was very lucky. Recently, a boy, a young man, not boy, a young man doing a PhD in the translation department of the JNU came to interview me because he told me that he's writing a PhD on a subject that involved writing on my translation of Premchand's biography by Amrit Rai. I asked him, so which other biographies have you taken up in your thesis? And he said, sir, only yours. And I did not feel flattered. I felt very annoyed. I said, what kind of a PhD is it that you can get by just examining the translation of one biography? What a cheap way to do a PhD. But I could not say this to him. His supervisor had approved it, the department had approved it. I've seen other PhDs too, which are not more substantial. What could I say? Anyhow, he asked me several questions about how we had gone about this young man, and I answered them. And I think, this kind of an introspection. I told him, he said, sir, this translation has had a huge success. And this is the last thing I will say. What is success and how does a translation succeed? I agree that that biography has had a tremendous success. So, how did it succeed? I identify three elements. One, it is the biography of Premchand. It had to succeed. How could it not succeed? So, if it succeeds, I think 70% at least of the credit goes to the fact that it's the biography of Premchand. 25% credit goes to Amrit Rai, that he wrote such a wonderful biography of Premchand. Already in Hindi, it had been greatly acclaimed, greatly criticized as well, and that may have affected his choice to edit the biography when it came to English translation. One of the biggest critics of that biography was, in fact, Ram Bilal Sharma, who wrote the biography of Nirala. Fellow Marxists, both of them, didn't stop from going hammer and tongs. Good thing. Very nice to see. And then perhaps 5 to 10% of the credit could be given to the translator. Too much for himself.